It is necessary, in attempting an honest account of the events that transpired on the Whitfield estate in the late spring and early summer of 1853, to begin not with dramatic proclamation nor with the fevered recollections of those who later came to speak on the subject, but rather with the ordinary rhythms of life as they were commonly observed upon that plantation. For it was in the quiet, repetitive, and seemingly unremarkable motions of each day, movements so habitual that even the enslaved ceased to think of them consciously, that the earliest signs of disorder first took root. The Whitfield plantation, situated some 20 miles inland from the Charleston Road and slightly north of the old Congaree route, possessed a reputation for order, prosperity, and political influence. Its owner, Elias Whitfield, was not merely a planter, but a man of legislative ambition, whose name appeared regularly in the Charleston Courier and the Columbia South Carolinian, most often in connection with matters of trade regulation, county elections, or debates concerning the conduct expected of servants and enslaved laborers. His household functioned as a kind of miniature apparatus of the state, strict, hierarchical, thoroughly confident in its own stability. The daily operations of the plantation followed a pattern at once monotonous and oppressive in its predictability. Before dawn, the enslaved field workers were roused from their quarters, the dim yellow light of lanterns revealing faces still lined with sleep, with fatigue carried over from the previous day, and with the dull resignation that comes of knowing precisely how one's next 14 hours will pass. Overseer Burnham, a man whose voice, even when calm, carried a kind of threat in its cadence, gave the first instructions. The tasks, tending to the cotton rows, mending field fences, hauling barrels of turpentine, clearing brush at the farther edge of the property, were assigned with little variation, and the slightest delay in beginning them was met with reprimand so habitual that it no longer summoned surprise on the part of its recipients. Within the main house, enslaved domestic workers commenced their duties with equal regularity, stoking fireplaces, hauling water for the kitchen and washing room, polishing the brass fixtures in the dining room, and carefully dusting the framed portraits of long-dead Whitfields whose stern, oil-painted faces surveyed the household from their elevated placement along the central hallway. It was within this environment, one of rigid schedules, unbroken silence in the presence of whites, and constant awareness of one's place, that the protagonist of this account, known in records only as Samuel, began his day. His precise age at the time cannot be stated with certainty. Estimations vary between 30 and 35. His tall, thin frame and unassuming manner allowed him to pass through corridors without attracting undue attention. Yet those who later reflected upon his actions noted that his eyes possessed a depth and alertness that distinguished him from many of the others. He worked principally within the household, though loaned to the fields when extra hands were needed. And it is in these domestic duties that he first observed the structural weaknesses, contradictions, and hidden resentments of the Whitfield abode. In the heavy humidity of the early summer months, the plantation house exuded a faint smell of old wood, damp stone, and the unmistakable bitterness of spilled laudanum. a substance kept in moderate supply in the master's room for reasons pertaining to his frequent headaches and nervous ailments. On the morning that begins this narrative, the 1st of June, a folded newspaper lay upon the table in the small office adjacent to the dining room, its pages streaked faintly with dust and marked with the creases of repeated handling. Samuel noticed it while sweeping the hallway, for the office door stood slightly ajar, and the white maid, Miss Parker, had neglected to remove it after serving Whitfield his morning coffee. The newspaper, though a common object in the house, bore on its upper margin a blot of ink and a torn edge, suggesting hastiness in its reading. Whitfield's scrawled initials in the corner indicated that he had intended to return to a particular column but had been distracted. Such marks, trivial to some, were not trivial to Samuel. He regarded all objects, books, bottles, scraps of paper, wooden boxes, keys left on tables, with the meticulous curiosity of one who understood that power often revealed itself in what masters failed to hide. The article that Whitfield had marked concerned the upcoming county assembly, to which several prominent men, his political cabinet, as it was sometimes jokingly called by neighbors, were expected to contribute their votes or commentary. Though Samuel did not dare to step fully into the room, he could see the bold letters of several names, all of which he recognized from the many evenings the master had hosted these men for dinners. The dinners were always conducted with pompous formality, the decanters of sherry polished to mirror-like clarity, the silver cutlery arranged in rigid symmetry, and the conversation shifting from trade to legislation to the various difficulties of managing what they termed labor contingencies. From the adjacent pantry, Samuel and the others often overheard these discussions, though they pretended otherwise. For this reason, seeing the names in print, names of men who sat at Whitfield's table, men whom Samuel had served with silent obedience, carried a subtle, unsettling weight. Later that morning, a second sign, small, almost too faint to carry meaning, surfaced in the form of a letter delivered by a courier from Columbia. The letter, addressed to Elias Whitfield's sister, Mrs. Margaret Lawson, contained remarks about the declining health of a cousin and news of an upcoming social gathering in Charleston. Its contents, as far as the household was concerned, were mundane. Yet Samuel, in taking the envelope to the master's study, noted the seal, a delicate embossing of the Lawson crest, which he had seen only a handful of times before. The seal was cracked not cleanly but in a jagged line, suggesting that Whitfield had opened the letter with uncharacteristic agitation. The master's voice, faintly audible through the study door, carried an edge that was not ordinarily present unless discussing political matters. Though Samuel did not linger long enough to make out the words, the tone left a faint impression, a kind of vibration of unease that settled into the afternoon air. It was in the servants' yard, during the short pause allowed before the noonday tasks, that whispers among the enslaved first reached Samuel's ears. Two men, Jacob and old Henry, spoke in low tones about the overseer's increasing irritability, speculating on whether Whitfield's recent political frustrations were being passed down through harsher discipline. The gossip itself was not unusual. What stood out to Samuel was the careful way the men avoided mentioning Whitfield by name, as though some unspoken threat had grown stronger in recent days. One woman, Miriam, murmured that she had found a small bottle behind the smokehouse door, one she had never seen before, a bottle with an unfamiliar label whose letters she could not read. She had handed it to Miss Parker, who dismissed it as trivial, yet the incident lingered in the workers' recollections. Such small occurrences, insignificant on their own, took on a cumulative weight, like the growing heaviness of humidity before a storm. By the second day of June, another event occurred that deserves mention, for though it was conducted behind closed doors, its effects radiated more clearly than Whitfield perhaps intended. While polishing the brass railings at the top of the staircase, Samuel overheard the faint murmur of voices rising from the study below. One belonged unmistakably to Mr. Nathaniel Price, a longtime associate of Whitfield, whose presence in the house usually signaled an upcoming political strategy. The two men spoke in words muffled by the thick oak of the study door, yet certain phrases reached the landing. Unreliable. Must be corrected. If one fails, all suffer. And even, at one point, consider alternatives. Though these words were likely spoken in reference to political challenges, perhaps a disputed ballot or disagreement within the cabinet, the sound of them, the sharpness of their tone, unsettled Samuel in ways he could not fully explain. After the meeting, Price left the house with visible agitation, adjusting his coat 3 times before stepping out into the bright sun. Late that afternoon, when the chores of the upper floor had been temporarily completed, Samuel found himself assigned to assist Miss Parker in sorting the pantry shelves, a task she always performed with fussy precision. While reaching for a jar of preserves on the upper shelf, his hand brushed lightly against a tin container he had not seen before, a small, cylindrical tin with a faded label indicating medicinal contents. Miss Parker, noticing the shift in his gaze, instructed him sharply to continue working and offered no explanation for the tin's presence. Yet as she turned her back, Samuel observed that she shifted the container behind several jars, as if to conceal it from casual view. He made no comment, asked no questions, and resumed his duties with the same reserved composure that characterized his behavior. But internally, something had altered, a faint but distinct recognition that the house was beginning to fill with small anomalies. On the evening of June 3rd, a discovery occurred that may be regarded as the earliest turning point in the narrative, though its significance was not apparent at the time. While retrieving linens from the storage closet off the main corridor, Samuel noticed that the ledger normally kept within a locked drawer of the sideboard had been left partially exposed. The drawer, though not fully open, had not been pushed entirely shut. He hesitated before approaching it, aware that any inquisitiveness on his part could invite suspicion. But the sight of the ledger, its spine cracked slightly, its corner frayed, drew his attention with a force that seemed almost beyond his own intention. He did not pull it out. He merely observed that the last page, faintly visible, bore financial entries written in Whitfield's meticulous hand. Among them, he saw references to purchases of tinctures, meal supplies, and something abbreviated simply as CVD, PDR, the meaning of which he did not then know. The notation had been circled, though whether by Whitfield or another hand could not be determined. The discovery was minor in appearance, but it lodged itself in Samuel's mind with quiet persistence. The first subtle act of defiance occurred 3 days later, on June 6th, when Whitfield requested that Samuel polish a particular set of glass decanters, those used for the Sunday evening gatherings. While carrying the tray into the dining room, Samuel paused for the briefest of moments near the tall window overlooking the yard, a moment too short to draw notice, but long enough for him to take in the full scene. The sun lowering over the rows of cotton, Burnham pacing slowly along the edge of the property, smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney, and the faint figures of the other enslaved workers moving silently toward their quarters. It was not the scene itself that constituted defiance, but the pause, the intentional, conscious decision to halt for a moment, to observe, and to allow himself a thought that did not pertain directly to an assigned task. This act, imperceptible to all others, marked a shift within him, for it was the first moment in which he allowed his own judgment to intervene against the mechanical obedience demanded of him. By the end of the first week of June, the household appeared outwardly unchanged, yet those who moved within it felt the weight of something gathering, a heaviness of atmosphere that pressed against the walls, settled in the corners, and hung in the air like the scent of damp wood. The architecture of the main house, with its tall windows, long corridors, and aging floorboards, seemed to amplify every sound. The creak of a step, the faint closing of a door, the muffled clearing of a throat behind a wall. In such an environment, even the smallest deviation, a misplaced object, an unfamiliar bottle, a tone of voice slightly sharper than usual, echoed disproportionately through the minds of the enslaved, who relied upon consistent patterns to anticipate danger. Thus the world of the Whitfield plantation, though still functioning in the orderly manner expected by its master, had begun to shift in ways subtle yet unmistakable. And within this shifting world moved Samuel, silent, observant, and carrying within him the earliest stirrings of a moral conflict whose full magnitude would not be evident until far later. The oppressive calm of those days, so deceptively stable, so heavy with unspoken tension, formed the soil in which the first seeds of the coming catastrophe took root. In the days that followed the quiet yet unmistakable shift that had settled over the Whitfield estate in early June, the atmosphere within both the main house and the slave quarters became increasingly strained. Though the rhythms of daily life appeared unchanged to any casual observer, those bound to the estate's labors sensed a gradual tightening, an invisible constriction that worked itself into speech, posture, and even the smallest interactions. It was as if the house, with its long corridors and heavy shutters, had begun to listen more carefully than before, while the surrounding fields, stretching out beneath the unrelenting Carolina sun, seemed to hold their breath under the weight of some unarticulated expectation. Samuel, in particular, carried this awareness with an acuity sharpened by the faint but cumulative anomalies he had witnessed in the preceding days. The marked newspaper, the jaggedly opened letter, the hidden tin in the pantry, and the partially exposed ledger with its cryptic chemical notation. Each of these small incidents, though insignificant when isolated, combined to form a pattern that quietly troubled his mind. By mid-June, as the heat grew heavier and the mosquitoes thickened in the humid air, Whitfield's political cabinet began to assemble more frequently on the estate. Their visits, once or twice a month in seasons of legislative quiet, now occurred nearly every week. The men arrived on horseback or by carriage, their coats dusted with the pale grit of the road, their collars dampened with perspiration despite their attempts at composure. Each carried the stern countenance of one accustomed to power and its attendant responsibilities. Their voices, when they entered the dining room or gathered upon the veranda, carried the weight of conviction, frustration, or self-importance, depending upon the matter at hand. Samuel, assigned to the household's domestic duties whenever such gatherings took place, observed these men with a quiet attentiveness that went unnoticed. He noted the way their eyes roamed the room, the manner in which they gestured, how quickly they consumed their drink, and the tones employed when speaking of matters pertaining to governance, property, or discipline. One evening in particular, June 12th, stands out as a moment in which the first movements toward the later poisoning became discernible. A humid haze had settled upon the estate, thick enough that even the lantern light seemed to waver within it. Whitfield had summoned his associates for what he described as an urgent consultation. Men such as Nathaniel Price, Judge Carrington, Dr. Horace Lake, and two others whose names appeared regularly in the regional papers sat around the dining table, their faces illuminated by the flickering candles. The discussion, overheard indistinctly from the pantry, concerned the increasing restlessness among plantation laborers in the county, rumors of small acts of sabotage, and fears, whether justified or exaggerated, of coordinated resistance. Though the tone of the conversation remained outwardly composed, there was an undercurrent of anxiety, sharpened by the awareness that their livelihood and authority depended upon maintaining unbroken control. At a certain point, Whitfield's voice rose above the muted exchange, uttering a phrase that Samuel would remember long after. If firmness is lacking, then order itself crumbles. Mercy, in these matters, is a form of negligence. The words, though not shouted, carried a blunt finality that resounded through the doorway and into the quiet of the pantry. They were followed by murmurs of agreement and the clinking of glasses. Such sentiments were not new to Samuel. He had heard variations of them before. Yet on this particular evening, something in the tone, the absolute conviction of it, struck him with unusual force. It was as though those words crystallized within his mind the stark contrast between the world as it was and the world as it might be if one were to challenge the established order. Later that night, while clearing the decanters and arranging the used glasses in the scullery, Samuel noticed that one of the cabinet members, Dr. Lake, had left behind a small leather case upon the sideboard. The case was partly unfastened, revealing the corner of a folded parchment and a faint metallic glint. Though Samuel did not dare to open it, he recognized the professional instruments within, a small vial wrapped in cloth, a thin metal spoon, and what appeared to be a tightly sealed bottle of tonic. Dr. Lake, known for his medical knowledge, often carried such items for emergencies during his travels. Still, the sight of them stirred something in Samuel's mind, a slow, forming idea that he did not yet articulate even to himself. Over the following days, whispered conversations among the enslaved grew sharper in tone and more cautious in delivery. The workers in the field spoke of the increased sternness of Overseer Burnham, whose temper, always quick to flare, now seemed perpetually on edge. Miriam, the woman who had earlier found the unfamiliar bottle near the smokehouse, murmured to the others that she had seen Miss Parker arguing with Whitfield's sister in the hallway, though she could not discern the subject of the dispute. Old Henry, whose age granted him a certain immunity from immediate suspicion, confided to Samuel that he believed the master's political dealings were becoming more desperate, though he offered no evidence to support the claim. Such exchanges, though rooted primarily in rumor, reflected a growing sense that the stability of the plantation, long enforced by rigid hierarchy, was beginning to show signs of strain. It was during this period of quiet unrest that Samuel's internal deliberations assumed a more definite shape. Though no explicit decision had yet been made, the thought, the possibility, began to settle in his mind with increasing clarity that there existed within the household numerous substances, ingredients, and opportunities whose potential had never been considered by those who believed themselves secure in their authority. He did not think of rebellion in the dramatic forms described in whispered stories of distant uprisings. Rather, he contemplated the precise vulnerabilities that accompanied the master's dependence upon his domestic workers, especially those entrusted with tasks involving food, drink, or medicinal supplies. Yet the moral tension of such thoughts weighed heavily upon him, for he had no desire to bring harm indiscriminately, nor to provoke suffering upon the innocent. His reflections wavered between the instinct for survival and the fear of consequence, a fear sharpened by the knowledge that discovery would mean not only his own death, but the punishment of others. The turning point, the first decisive step toward action, occurred on June 17th. That morning, Whitfield instructed Samuel to fetch a bottle of laudanum from the upper cabinet in his private room, explaining that he required it for his persistent headaches. Samuel ascended the stairs with steady steps, his mind composed despite the tension coiling within him. Upon reaching the room, he opened the cabinet and located the bottle, its glass surface cool in his hand. It was then that he noticed a smaller vial, placed just behind the laudanum, its label worn and nearly illegible. The faded text suggested that it contained a concentrated substance used for treating livestock ailments, one with potent properties when applied incorrectly. Samuel did not remove the vial. He did not touch it, but he stood there for a moment longer than necessary, reading the faint letters, committing their shape to memory. And in that moment, a decision, unspoken, fragile, yet irrevocable, took root within him. Several days later, a minor incident occurred that, in retrospect, may be regarded as the first experimental act, the initial, cautious attempt to test the boundaries of what might be possible. On June 20th, During one of the cabinet gatherings, Samuel was tasked with serving wine to the assembled men. The evening air hung thick with dust and the scent of tobacco smoke, and the men, flush with drink and conversation, paid little attention to the precise movements of the servants. While pouring from a decanter, Samuel noted that one of the glasses belonged to Judge Carrington, a man known for his particularly harsh stance on matters of discipline. What Samuel did next was subtle, nearly imperceptible. He delayed for a fraction of a second longer over Carrington's glass, allowing a trace of sediment, harmless, yet unusual in texture, to slip from the bottom of the decanter. The effect on the judge was minimal. He coughed once, frowned, and muttered something about the wine's age, but no suspicion arose. Still, the moment carried significance. It marked the first instance in which Samuel's actions departed from pure obedience. Yet the path ahead was fraught with danger, as became clear only 2 days later. While cleaning the sideboard in the dining room, Samuel came nearer to discovery than at any point in the events that followed. He had been examining the arrangement of bottles, purely in thought, for he touched none, when Miss Parker entered the room unexpectedly. Her gaze, sharp and searching, lingered upon him with a suspicion that might have escalated had she arrived moments earlier. Samuel, maintaining his composure, stepped back from the sideboard and resumed wiping the table, offering no indication that he had been engaged in anything beyond his assigned duties. Miss Parker said nothing, yet the tension of the moment impressed itself upon him with startling clarity. He realized then that any misstep, any gesture even slightly out of place, could unravel all that he had begun to contemplate. It was a lesson that sharpened his caution and deepened his resolve. Throughout late June, the dynamics within the Whitfield household continued to shift, albeit subtly. Whitfield himself grew increasingly irritable, pacing the length of his study late into the night and summoning Dr. Lake with greater frequency for consultations regarding his health. The cabinet members, too, seemed unsettled, their tones sharper, their discussions more urgent. They spoke of legislation, of unrest, of the need to impose firmer measures upon labor. They spoke also of rumors from neighboring counties, small fires, stolen tools, mysterious sickness among livestock, treating each incident as evidence of broader instability. Their words, carried through hallways and across the veranda, settled heavily in the minds of the enslaved, who were acutely aware that any perceived threat, however unfounded, could result in severe reprisals. Amid this growing tension, Samuel's internal struggle intensified. He found himself increasingly caught between the desire to act and the fear of consequence, between the impulse to protect those around him and the recognition that inaction might condemn them to continued suffering. His moments of quiet reflection, snatched in the brief intervals between tasks, were filled with questions of loyalty, guilt, and the nature of justice. Could an act of defiance, even one intended to protect the innocent, be separated from its inevitable cost? Could harm inflicted upon the guilty ever be justified, knowing that the repercussions might fall upon the helpless? These were not questions he could answer, yet they guided his thoughts as steadily as any moral compass. Thus the weeks passed, with the oppressive heat of June pressing ever more heavily upon the estate, and with the household, both its masters and its servants, moving through a world growing increasingly brittle. The smallest actions carried greater weight. The faintest whispers seemed laden with significance. And within this atmosphere, Samuel took his first deliberate steps along a path from which he would not later turn, though the full consequences of these steps would not be felt until the weeks that followed. The rising conflict, quiet, deliberate, and invisible to those who believed themselves in control, had begun. The third segment of the account begins with the first settled days of late August, when the heat in the low-lying parts of the Ashley River Basin became so heavy that even the insects moved languidly, and the cypress groves along the marsh appeared to hold their breath under the weight of the season. The plantation ledger of that month, kept in the master's slanted but forceful hand, notes only the usual figures: cotton yields, molasses barrels, wages for the overseers, receipts from Charleston, but lacks the single detail that all who lived on the property felt with unmistakable clarity: that a quiet tremor had begun to run beneath the daily order of things. The cause was not yet named aloud, but the sensation was already there, circulating through kitchens, passageways, back rooms, night cabins, and the shadowed edges of the fields. It was, in its earliest form, no more than certain unusual silences, intervals in which men ceased speaking mid-task, and women unconsciously lowered their eyes as though expecting a reprimand that did not come. The enslaved man at the center of this narrative, whose intelligence was never accurately recorded in any surviving document, though it has been attested by numerous indirect sources, continued to move through the estate with the same steady, nearly featureless manner that the household staff had long associated with him. Yet this composure, which had once been merely a shield against attention, now served as an instrument for obscuring intentions that had grown sharper, clearer, and more defined with every passing day. His posture remained correct. His hands moved with the same restrained precision when preparing the household's medicinal herbs, cleaning the dining implements, or carrying water from the pump. His responses to direct orders remained as mild and respectful as ever. But beneath that surface, his observations were constant, deliberate, and carried out with a depth of scrutiny that few around him suspected. Several small but significant complications emerged during this period. A younger field hand, nervous and too familiar with the kitchen comings and goings, began lingering near the back porch at unusual hours, claiming to be awaiting instructions. Another man, older, stern, and deeply loyal to the master's family out of a belief that obedience ensured survival, began watching the protagonist more closely, convinced that something in his manner had changed. The overseer, Mr. Grayson, who had always prided himself on noticing unrest before it took root, remarked once, in a letter later found among the estate papers, that a mood of reluctance has settled among certain of the house servants, one I cannot yet name, though I have marked it in eyes that avoid mine, in tasks done too carefully, in voices dropped too low. This observation, though vague, marked the overseer's first quiet suspicion. Meanwhile, the master's political cabinet, composed of 3 men from Charleston, one from Columbia, and one whose influence extended beyond state borders, had begun visiting the plantation with increased frequency. Their purposes were recorded as discussions on legislative matters, tariffs, transportation bonds, and certain matters connected with the Fugitive Slave Act. Yet their presence, always accompanied by late evenings of drinking, tobacco smoke, and fervent debate, added pressure to a household already straining under heat and unspoken anxiety. Those evenings offered the protagonist both danger and opportunity. Danger, because the increase in activity brought more eyes, more unpredictability, more chance that some detail might be noticed. Opportunity, because the cabinet's gatherings required substantial preparation of food and drink, granting him access to the very vessels that would eventually bear the agents of his plan. It was during the second week of August that he took the first decisive step, one that could not be undone. According to later testimony from a housemaid, he removed from the medicinal cabinet a small amount of a substance used by the master to treat intestinal ailments, a powder whose strength was well known. The maid, though uncertain, described seeing him measure it into a paper twist, his hands calm, his expression unreadable. She said nothing at the time, believing it merely part of the day's ordinary tasks. But in her later description to investigators, she stated that he moved as though he had already chosen the end of the road, and nothing in the world could change his direction. Complications arose almost immediately. Another servant, one with a long history of informing the overseer of anything unusual, was seen passing through the hallway at the moment the protagonist emerged from the cabinet room. No words were exchanged, but the glance was enough to unsettle the protagonist. For 2 days thereafter, he refrained from taking any further steps, waiting to see if suspicion would take shape. The overseer questioned the staff about broken equipment, missing linens, and misplaced tools, searching for any excuse that might reveal a larger truth. But no mention was made of the powder, and the temporary danger passed. Yet the household itself was beginning to show unmistakable strain. The master's wife, a woman of frail constitution, complained of headaches and fatigue, attributes the household attributed to humidity. The overseer, irritated by minor delays in field work, issued harsher reprimands, increasing the general tension. In the quarters, conversations grew short and cautious. The women prayed more frequently, murmuring quiet supplications that the growing unease would pass. The men held brief whispered conferences in doorways and behind sheds, debating whether some unseen threat was approaching or whether recent behavior among the house servants foretold punishment. No one, not even those closest to the protagonist, understood the truth. Yet everyone felt the air grow heavier, as though the plantation itself were drawing a slow, anxious breath. The first significant collapse occurred on an evening when the cabinet members had gathered to discuss the political implications of a recent speech delivered in Charleston. The meal had been prepared with meticulous detail. The protagonist moved through the dining room with his usual composure, pouring wine, adjusting plates, refilling glasses, noting which items were consumed most readily. Near the end of the evening, one of the younger cabinet members, Mr. Sutterfield, known for speaking too quickly and drinking too freely, began to show visible signs of distress. His complexion turned pale, his speech grew slurred, perspiration appeared across his brow in a sudden sheen. At first his companions assumed him drunker than usual, but when he attempted to stand and instead gripped the edge of the table with trembling fingers, the entire gathering fell silent. The master called for water. The protagonist brought it, his steps steady, his expression unchanged. The man attempted to drink, but could not swallow without difficulty. His chair was moved back, and he was escorted to a nearby room to lie down. The household's nightly routine fractured around him, servants rushing, the overseer shouting orders, cabinet members muttering concerns. The protagonist withdrew to the kitchen, where he waited, listening. No one suspected him. No one yet connected the illness to anything beyond the wine and the heat. But the tremor had begun. The social order wavered, however slightly, as if tested by a pressure none of them had anticipated. In the following days, the household entered a state of quiet, feverish uncertainty. The cabinet member recovered more slowly than expected. The master wrote letters requesting medical advice. The overseer increased surveillance of the enslaved, convinced that disobedience was brewing, though he lacked any evidence to support the suspicion. The protagonist observed all of this with careful, measured attention. And through it all, the smells of sickness drifted through the halls, the sourness of sweat, the metallic scent of fever, the sharp odor of camphor rubbed on trembling limbs. At night the candles flickered against the wood-paneled walls, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and retract with each nervous movement. Pages of letters were folded and refolded. Physicians' notes were carried in hurried footsteps. Prayers were whispered more urgently. It was no longer possible for the household to pretend that nothing had changed. The faint instability that had once been a mere sensation was now a fact. Something had shifted in the invisible architecture of their lives. Something was slipping, quietly but unmistakably, out of the master's control. The final sequence of events began on a late afternoon when the sky over the Ashley River darkened with the approach of a storm that had been building for days. The clouds hung low enough that the tops of the cypress trees seemed to sink under their weight, and the air took on the stillness that precedes a violent change in the weather. The master's cabinet had arrived that morning for what was described as a decisive meeting concerning pending legislation, though those within the household understood it as simply another of the long, tense gatherings that had come to define the estate's recent months. 5 men, each carrying the gravity of political influence and the private anxieties of their own ambitions, took their seats in the dining room shortly after midday, unaware that this would become the final meeting they would ever attend together. The protagonist moved among them with the same composed efficiency that had characterized his work for years. He adjusted curtains, brought in water, prepared the wine, and carried trays whose weight had become familiar to his hands long before the thought of resistance had ever lodged itself within him. But this afternoon carried a different tension, one he could feel in the stiffness of his own movements, in the way he measured his breaths against the sounds in the hallway. He had known for weeks that this moment would come. The preparations had been quiet, meticulous, and spared of sentiment. Now the opportunity had arrived in full, irreversible, stark, and edged with dread. The first signs were indistinguishable from the usual discomfort brought on by the heat. One of the cabinet members, Mr. Halden, paused during conversation to press a hand to his temple, complaining of a sudden pressure behind his eyes. No one paid particular attention. The men had been drinking heavily, and the day was stifling. But within moments, another man coughed in a strained and unfamiliar manner, as though his throat had tightened unexpectedly. A third shifted in his seat and remarked that the wine had a bitter echo, though he laughed it off, attributing the taste to the lingering humidity in the room. The protagonist stood near the doorway, his hands clasped behind him, observing with the same neutrality he had cultivated all his life. Yet within him, something shifted, an internal weight pressing sharply against his composure. He had prepared himself for the consequences of this act, had spent countless nights rehearsing the likely outcomes, the interrogations, the punishments, the possibility of death. But nothing had prepared him for the moment when theory dissolved into reality, when men who had long wielded power casually and without consequence began to exhibit the unmistakable signs of its violent reversal. It was Mr. Sutterfield, the same man who had taken ill weeks earlier, who collapsed first. He gripped the edge of the table with both hands, his knuckles whitening, and tried to speak, but the effort produced only a strained gasp. The master rose from his seat, his chair scraping sharply against the wood floor, and called for water. The protagonist brought it, stepping forward silently. But as Sutterfield attempted to drink, he recoiled, dropping the glass, which shattered against the floor. His breathing grew ragged. His teeth clenched involuntarily. A tremor passed through his arms. The table fell into disarray as the cabinet members surged to his side. The master's voice rose sharply, commanding the servants to summon the overseer, the stable boy, the physician from the neighboring estate, anyone who might aid in restoring order. Footsteps thundered across hallways. Doors opened violently. Voices overlapped. The storm outside broke in a flurry of wind and thunder so sudden that it rattled the window panes. And beneath all of it, the protagonist remained still, steady, yet filled with an internal pressure so intense that it threatened to shatter the shell of calm he had worn all his life. Within minutes, a second cabinet member fell to his knees beside his chair, clutching his stomach. Another slammed a hand against the wall to steady himself, his face contorting in pain. Panic spread quickly, not only among the men collapsing in the dining room, but among the servants who watched from doorways, unsure whether to intervene or flee. The hierarchy that had defined every moment of their lives began to unravel with terrifying speed. Commands issued by the master went unanswered or were repeated with confusion. The overseer shouted orders that no one followed. The social machinery, so finely calibrated through terror and discipline, buckled under the weight of uncontrollable human suffering. For the enslaved population, the moment was unbearably complex. Some stood frozen in shock, uncertain whether helping would align them with justice or condemn them as accomplices. Others stepped forward with instinctive compassion, offering water, cloths, or steadying arms, their faces taut with fear. Still others withdrew into corners, unwilling to be seen, unwilling to risk implication. No clear moral line existed for them. Only the immediate calculus of danger, survival, and the quiet hope that something irreversible was at last unfolding before their eyes. The master, meanwhile, moved between desperation and rage. His authority, long taken for granted, now slipped out of his grasp like water between trembling fingers. He shouted for order, demanded explanations, accused the kitchen staff of negligence, then turned his fury toward the wine merchant, toward the weather, toward fate itself. At one point he seized the protagonist by the arm, insisting he reveal what had been placed in the wine. The protagonist did not flinch. He met the master's gaze with a steadiness that would later be described by witnesses as unervingly calm. In that moment, the master's grip faltered, not from uncertainty, but from the first dawning recognition that he stood at the edge of a truth he was too terrified to face. As the hours progressed, the suffering intensified. 2 cabinet members began vomiting violently, unable to stand. Another lost consciousness entirely, his breath shallow and uneven. Sutterfield convulsed despite the efforts to restrain him. The storm outside continued its assault, wind howling across the porch, rain striking the roof in relentless sheets. The candles flickered wildly, casting distorted shadows that made the scene appear almost spectral, though its horror was rooted entirely in the physical and the human. The household's attempts to restore order all failed. Messages sent for physicians were delayed by the storm. Remedies hastily prepared in the kitchen proved useless. The overseer, driven to panic, interrogated servants at random, searching for a confession, a clue, anything that might explain the catastrophe. But the truth remained hidden beneath layers of fear, deceit, and the protagonist's calm silence. By nightfall, 1 cabinet member had died. Another hovered at the edge of death, his skin cold, his pulse faint. The master had retreated to his study, pacing in frantic circles, his eyes fixed on the floor as though searching for an escape from the consequences he could neither understand nor control. The protagonist, standing alone in the hallway, listened to the sounds emanating from the dining room, the wet gasps, the half-formed cries, the scrape of chairs, the whispered prayers. Each sound carved itself into his mind with unrelenting clarity. And in that hour, he confronted the full weight of what he had done, not with regret, though sorrow moved within him like a slow tide, but with the sober recognition that the world he had known would never return. He had crossed the boundary that separated endurance from action, and now stood in the liminal space that follows an irreversible breaking. The storm began to ease just after midnight, though the suffering within the plantation house did not. The air carried the smell of sweat, blood, and spilt wine. Candles burned low. No one slept. The enslaved population remained alert, tense, waiting to see whether dawn would bring retribution, liberation, or a reckoning beyond anything they had imagined. Some prayed quietly. Others sat in silence. A few stared at the protagonist with a mixture of fear and awe, as though sensing that he had become the hinge upon which their world now turned. When the second man died shortly before dawn, the master emerged from his study looking older than he had appeared even the day before. His voice was hoarse, his steps unsteady. He surveyed the ruined dining room, the trembling servants, the lifeless figure on the floor. His authority was gone, shattered not only by the deaths, but by the unmistakable evidence that power, once absolute, could be undone in a matter of hours by a single invisible act. And though accusations would soon come, though interrogations and confessions and judgments still lay ahead, the true confrontation had already taken place, not between master and servant, but between the fragile architecture of a brutal system and the human being who had decided, quietly and alone, to pull out one of its supporting stones. The collapse was now complete. The days following the collapse of the master's cabinet passed with the heavy, suffocating slowness of a household trapped between grief and terror. The plantation, once governed by strict routines and the rhythms of labor, now fell into a disordered quiet. The dining room where the men had suffered their final hours remained sealed. The chairs overturned exactly as they had fallen, the stains on the floor only partially scrubbed away. No one wished to enter the space. Even the master avoided it, moving instead between his study and the veranda like a man walking the perimeter of a ruined kingdom. His voice, once forceful and precise, had dimmed into a rasp marked by disbelief. Word spread across the estate with the speed of rumor, weaving its way through slave quarters, across fields, and into the nearby township. But with each retelling, the narrative twisted slightly. Some claimed the men had been struck by a mysterious fever carried in the storm. Others suggested a curse, whispered by an enslaved woman whose son had been whipped the week prior. Still others insisted the wine had spoiled in the summer heat. The lack of a definitive explanation allowed people to fill the void with whatever truth they found most tolerable. In that void, suspicion began to surge in unpredictable directions. Interrogations began on the second day. The overseer, shaken but determined, questioned the kitchen staff first, demanding to know what had been placed in the wine, the food, the water. He paced back and forth before them with the feverish energy of a man seeking certainty in a world that had ceased to obey familiar rules. Each servant was asked to recount every moment leading up to the meal, every ingredient touched, every jar opened. Their answers, rehearsed out of fear or shaped by imperfect memory, only deepened his frustration. Nothing could be proven. No confession emerged. And with the physician declaring that the exact cause of death could not be precisely identified, the overseer's fury gave way to paranoia. The protagonist was summoned on the third day. He entered the study with his usual composure, though those who observed him later noted that his steps were slower and his hands briefly clenched at his sides. The master sat behind his desk, his eyes hollow and rimmed with fatigue. He looked not at the protagonist, but rather through him, as if searching for an explanation he feared to articulate. The overseer stood in the corner, arms crossed, gaze sharp. The questioning was quiet, exhausted rather than accusatory. The master asked where he had been during the meeting, what he had served, whether he had noticed anything out of place. The protagonist answered with measured calm, his voice steady, neither defiant nor afraid. No evidence existed to contradict him. No witness could place anything unusual in his actions. After several minutes of aimless questioning, he was dismissed. Yet dismissal did not equal absolution. In the slave quarters, tension twisted itself into new shapes. Some viewed the protagonist with reverence, believing he had done what they had never dared dream. Others looked upon him with fear, unsure whether his actions, if indeed they were his, would bring devastating reprisals down upon them all. A few avoided him entirely, as though proximity alone might draw suspicion. He moved through these shifting reactions with the same muted expression he had always worn, yet internally he carried the weight of every whispered doubt, every frightened glance. The funerals of the cabinet members were held quietly and with little of the ceremony one might expect for men of their stature. Their families, shocked and embarrassed, wished to avoid public scrutiny. Wagons bearing the bodies traveled down the muddy road in a grim procession, accompanied by the distant roll of thunder left over from the storm. The local newspaper printed a brief acknowledgment. 5 gentlemen, taken suddenly ill during a private gathering on the night of the 14th, cause undetermined. The lack of detail was intentional. It concealed more than it revealed. Within the plantation, however, memory refused to remain orderly. Servants recounted the final moments in the dining room with growing embellishment. One man insisted he had seen a cabinet member claw at the table like a drowning swimmer grasping for air. A young girl claimed she had heard the master cry out in a tone she had never imagined possible. These recollections, traded around small fires at night, slowly evolved into a kind of collective testimony, a fractured archive shaped more by fear and awe than by accuracy. And in the center of these accounts stood the protagonist, sometimes portrayed as a silent witness, sometimes as the quiet architect of justice, sometimes as a man haunted by his own choices. The truth was that he had no clear fate waiting for him. The master, shaken to his core, hesitated to pursue punishment without certainty. The overseer pushed for harsher action, but lacked proof. Rumors circulated that a professional investigator might be summoned from Charleston, but none arrived. Days turned into weeks, and the urgency to uncover the culprit began to erode under the greater desire to restore order. The plantation could not remain in chaos indefinitely. Crops needed tending. Livestock required care. Life, imperfect, heavy, and unchanged in its brutal expectations, pressed forward. In this environment, the protagonist made a choice of his own. Late one night, while most of the household slept and the last lanterns flickered faintly in the wind, he gathered what few possessions he owned: a cloth satchel, a scrap of rope, and a folded piece of paper containing the names of relatives sold away years earlier. He did not say farewell to anyone. He moved through the shadows with practiced ease, passing the slave quarters, the deserted work sheds, the broken wagon near the barn. The road leading away from the plantation stretched into the darkness like a narrow promise. By dawn, he was gone. Whether he was captured, killed, or successful in his escape was never officially recorded. Some claim to have seen him weeks later in Savannah, working at a dock shed under an assumed name. Others believed he died in a swamp not far from the plantation, his body taken by the marshes. A few insisted he boarded a ship headed north. No single version took hold. His fate became part of the story's mystery, an unresolved detail that allowed different communities to shape the ending according to their beliefs, their fears, or their hopes. In the decades that followed, the event lived on not in official records, but in fragmented narratives. A traveling preacher once referenced the poisoned judgment of 53 in a sermon. A schoolteacher recopied the newspaper clipping and tucked it into a leather-bound volume of local history. An elderly woman, who had lived on the plantation as a child, described the night as a cloud that never passed. Each retelling softened certain edges and sharpened others, transforming historical fact into something closer to folklore. Dark, ambiguous, morally layered. Years later, when descendants sifted through old letters, ledgers, and diaries, they found no explicit confession and no documented motive. What they found instead were patterns of cruelty, of silence, of unspoken grievances, of lives lived under unbearable tension. And in those patterns, the event became less a mystery of individual guilt and more a testimony to the consequences of a society built on domination. The modern reader, sitting today, far removed from the world of 1853, might find themselves uneasy with the lack of closure. They might search for a clear villain or a clean moral line. But history rarely offers such simplicity. It leaves us with questions, with contradictions, with the uncomfortable awareness that oppression and justice do not exist as isolated opposites, but as forces that crash into each other in unpredictable ways. And now, to you, the viewer, the listener, the reader. If you followed this story to its end, consider this. What is justice when a system itself is unjust? Can vengeance be condemned when the cruelty that preceded it was normalized, legal, and celebrated? Should a man be judged by his actions alone, or by the circumstances that shaped every moment of his life? If you had lived in South Carolina in the summer of 1853, under those laws, under that hierarchy, under that constant threat, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments below. And if stories like this make you question how history is remembered, and who gets to tell it, don't forget to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, where we uncover the darkest stories the official books never dared to print.